it off. Good evening, folks, and welcome to FMA Discussion. This is episode 475, and tonight it's going to be more theme-oriented. We're going to be talking about Espada Daga. This may go a few episodes, so we're going to see how it goes. If that's the case, look forward to following sequence to this. But anyway, the guests tonight are Elrik Jundis. He's been on before. We got Tim Rivera, new, and we got two new folks, and Raymundo, Lucero. So without further ado, I'm going to be bringing these guys up. If you have questions, put them in the comment section. I will get to them. However, if they're not within the flow of the conversation, I will jot them down and wait to get to them, just so not to interrupt the flow. Also, please tell us where you're watching from and smash that like button. And here we go. All right, I'm just going to change this. Much better. Okay. All right, hey guys, how you doing?
Evening, Dean. Good morning, Raymundo. And
hello,
hi, Tim.
good day, everyone.
And Tim can still hear us. Okay.
Dean, sorry. Can you say again, why did you want to have this conversation? Where did the impetus come from, Espada Daga?
Yeah, I've always been interested. It's one of my favorite things to practice just because of the puzzle-like aspect to it. So I've always been intrigued by it, and I've always heard mixed things as far as the historical aspect, as far as how much of the Spanish influence. Was there any history or proof that existed pre-Spanish times? And, I've heard mixed, conflicting things. So I just thought that'd be a great thing, just get some folks on here who could talk specifically on that with some certain degree of expertise. So that's what really triggered it. But there was also an incident that somebody messaged me, hey, by the way, you should do it. And the name is escaping me, unfortunately, but there was a suggestion also from a consistent viewer who also suggested, but it definitely was something I've always thought about. To be honest, I just didn't know who to get. You know what I mean? Like, I just didn't know. And then when I put the feeler out there, then all your guys' names came up. And so that's, yeah. And then we did, of course, the kind of test run, pre-run on FMA Discussion, which was quite fascinating. And that drew a bunch of interest. So here we are.
And Raymundo and Tim, I'm sorry, but I'm just I feel like I want to introduce you guys to people who don't know you. But one of the groups I run is Hema Philippines, and that was sort of like my attempt to create a community that was that was removed from the FMA community, but it was people who were into blades, and then it was specifically for people interested in Hema, which is historical European martial arts. And it was a place for me to share my research and then also post things. And all throughout that process, I'd always get messages from Tim. Like, hey, you really can't say that, or giving me different reasons to rethink my level of assertion and to maybe reframe it as, okay, this is a hypothesis. And then also Tim should be known as, in terms of like a source person for Spanish or Iberian fencing, because he's literally the person who has translated the old Spanish documents, and also it's the oldest Spanish non-distress manual, correct, Tim?
Yeah.
Yeah, Godinho. And then Raymundo, I thought was also really, we are friends for a number of different reasons. We met first sparring, but he's one of the foremost researchers in the Philippines on the antique blades, and also repatriating antique blades, and then connecting with people who might have collections in the hundreds just for one region of the Philippines. So when you have that much material record, you see things that other people don't see. You understand things about the traditional blades and then how they might have been used in different ways. But all three of us are researchers, and one of the things we just wanted to open up with is the worldview and the challenge of that. And I'll leave it, do you want to say anything about that first, Raymundo or Tim, about what it is to be a researcher and then having to let go of maybe loved beliefs at different times? And then Raymundo, just say no if you could mute it, because I can hear Tagalog in the background, so I assume that's you.
Sorry.
Or you can put it back on if you're going to talk first. Tim, do you want to go first?
Yeah, I mean, it's difficult, I think, because it is human nature to want to, nobody gets into research without wanting to find something, one way or another, and so it's hard to put that aside when you're researching, when you're looking into this, and so there's a thing called confirmation bias, which everybody falls into. You're looking for a particular thing, so whenever you find something, you're going to interpret it in that light. So you may interpret it differently, so that it maybe um, can be seen as evidence or proof toward the thing that you're looking for, or there will maybe be bits that you're going to miss or you're going to discard because they might go against the personal theory that you have. So that's really one of the biggest challenges, because we're all subject to it. It's not something you can get away from. So it's just something you have to be conscious of when you're doing this.
Mundo, do you want to add anything?
Sorry, there's a lag in my uh, unmute. I agree with everything that Tim said, and it's actually amusing. I mean, when you form hypothesis at the start, and then you go through all those research materials, and then you start taking off your hypothesis as, okay, this is wrong. Okay, this is still alive. Okay, this hypothesis is about to die. Stuff like that is what makes research worth it. It's challenging, and yeah, it's exhilarating.
And it's did you want to say anything else, Raimundo? Or I'll just jump in. So I just want to
Yeah,
share, like,
go
one
ahead.
of when I first got into FMA, like many, I read Inosanto's book, and then I was like, oh, I want to study from people, I want to learn Kali, and then my first lineage was a system that had used Eskrima and never chose Kali, and in fact, the Grandmaster hated the word Kali. And then my first trip to the Philippines, '93, then I'm talking to all these old men and asking questions. And then for better or worse, then I found a whole bunch of people who validated that thing. Oh yeah, no one uses Kali. I'm asking folks like Antonio Ilustrisimo, Jose Mena, people who were fighting with FMA pre-World War II, training in communities where it was a thing, and none of them had heard of Kali. And then like later on, years later, I was able to train with a Basilan lineage, and like, oh yeah, Basilan is a Moro area. They study Salat and Kuntao and other arts there. And they're like, oh no, there's no Kali down here. And then he took me to meet other Salat masters from Jolo and other parts of Mindanao, no Kali. So I was really convinced. And then, but I was still willing to look. But then lo and behold, Lorenz Lasco, who's a really well-respected blade researcher here in the Philippines, like he's literally seen thousands of antiques in museums in Europe, America, Philippines, and some of the private, like people don't realize there's collections in the Philippines with like hundreds, like 600 plus antique blades. They're all antiques. Most of them also are all repatriates from America or the parts of the world. People don't realize, like, they come to the Philippines looking for antiques. They're actually in the West, in other parts of the world. Anyway, Loren Velasco had the brilliant idea to go check out all the old dictionarios, which were when the Spanish were first coming to the Philippines and wanting to convert the natives and then also, govern them. He looked for the word Kali, and then lo and behold, he found it. And then also, here's the surprising thing: the old story was Luzon is Arnis, Visayas is Eskrima, and Mindanao is Kali. Well, up to this point in time, it wasn't nowhere for like pre-1970s, but then Lorenz Lasco found 17th century and earlier dictionarios where Kali is recorded, and where it's most prominently used was actually in Luzon. So I'm like, that's no longer a myth. It's an actually old word, but more common was Kalis. And if you want to contradict me, because Raimundo might want to say this, or if anyone wants to jump in, please do. You want to add anything to the Kali thing since I brought it up? But I just brought it up for the point of we have to change our stance when it's proven wrong. Anything else, Tim or Raimundo?
If they don't, I have a comment.
No, sure. I mean, jump. This is supposed to be a dialogue, so we can just jump in anywhere.
So,
And we also have some slides later, D,
so
just so you know.
that's something similar that I was exposed to. That yeah, the Visayan region here at Eskrima, Luzon was our niece, Mindanao, Cali. So, but then they were saying, which was coming back, and actually through these episodes, no less, was that no, the term Kali is a Western term. It's not over here and there. So, just correct me if I'm wrong. You're saying there is actual evidence that the word is used over there or has been used?
So here's my hypothesis on it, because there's so much data of like, okay, it really wasn't used in the Philippines for a number of generations. It all goes back to I forget which author it is. So this is Kali wasn't supposed to be the topic, but there's like some articles that came out in the 1940s and 1950s, and that person basically is the person who said, "Oh, Arnis Luzon, would you Visayas is Eskrima, and Mindanao is Kali." And then my hypothesis is Ben Largusa must have seen this information, and then from there it went to Dan and Santo. From Dan and Santo, there's like narratives of like Bill McGrath's original certificate said Arnis, but then after he visited Dan and Santo, then okay, now it's Kili Church of
Right.
Kali. So that's really the birth of Kali in America, is really Dan and Santo, Leo Guy, and then it went international. And then when FMA became sport and really promoted in the 70s during the Marcos era, that's when also to bring in the Kali practitioners from the United States, it was started to be used in the Philippines, and then other arts started to use the term Kali or Kalis.
Okay.
I hope you don't mind me adding, Elrik.
No, yeah, please.
Yeah. To my knowledge, the the dictionary that first mentioned Kali was in the Ibanag context. So I actually have a friend who was a thesis on partly on Ibanag terms and weapons and fighting arts. So they actually used the word Kali, and it also appears in some oral traditions in the Ilocano fighting arts, which is Pagkali-Kali. We have to look at it in the context of that. This term may have spread from starting from Northern Luzon and was used to describe fighting arts in general. Because if, for example, I'm a Northern Luzon speaker, and then I see a Visayan practicing Eskrima, I see, oh, that's Pagkali-Kali, or that's Kali. And then, but it does not mean that Kali is legitimately associated with the Visayans. It just happened that I'm a Northern speaker. So there's a point of view thing going on there, that somehow the term gets ported over to other people, other locations, even other arts. So here we see an effect which one of my mentor calls as a term pollution, because the word starts to spread and gets associated. It takes on a different life of its own. So suddenly the Visayans are calling their art Kali. Or suddenly the Visayans are saying, oh, hey, you people in the Mindanao and Sulu, you're also doing Kali. So you see there's a chain reaction of the term being spread. I would not say that it's a quote unquote misuse, but there's definitely some pollution that went on with regards to the usage of this term. So I believe that's my personal hypothesis of why Kali became so popular, because it spread out it polluted other languages, other locations, other people, other fighting arts in the archipelago. Yeah, that's my personal take on it.
I'm going to debate you on it, Raimundo. Uh, Probably,
Our first debate.
yeah, in a small context, yes, but the fact that there's a vacuum of no one actually knowing the term in terms of elders, and I've gone, it's something because of my confirmation bias. I've been asking this question for 30 years, and it's there's certain lineages like they're saying no, we've always had it and it always existed, but usually it's like no, we haven't heard of it. But I do get the sense of it, the polluting. The other thing I also just want to bring up in terms of context is Dan Inosanto didn't write his book in a vacuum. He wrote that during, not too long after the civil rights era. So there was I remember as a kid in the States back then, like you could find Michelob beer posters of like the kings and queens of Africa, or posters about the Chinese building the railroads in America. So there's a strong push for people of color in the United States to like embrace their heritage and also push away anything European. So I look at that as like, that probably influenced the use of Kali and also trying to downplay other influences, even though as we'll go into, especially, I mean, they didn't know before, but now we know. It's like, there was lots of opportunities for European influence, but I think it's like tempura, meaning tempura, the Japanese fried shrimp. It's like everyone knows that is a Japanese dish, but they first learned how to fry from the Portuguese and Dutch, but it's a Japanese dish. And so, Espada Daga is Filipino Espada Daga, but where did it first come from, and how did it first get influenced? And we'll start to debate in that. And Tim and Raymundo, do you want to say anything else, or should I start to put up the slides? If you want to jump into that first or add something.
Just one last thing from me. Just a parting shot for Kali. I mean, this is a different rabbit hole. We all know this is a rabbit hole. But the last bit of my hypothesis on that is that the main gateway for Filipino martial arts going into the United States was for me actually Hawaii, because as we all know, a lot of current practitioners trace their lineages from practitioners who came from Hawaii, from Filipinos who work in Hawaii. And there is actually a great population of Northern Luzon Filipinos who were at Hawaii even before World War II. So for me, that's already a big clue on why Kali became a popular term in the United States, because you have Northern Luzon people going there, and certainly of Ilocano and Ibanag descent. So yeah, for me, that's how the term found its way there.
Here's a question that just
That's all.
came
Sure.
in.
Sure.
And it's from Maestro Alvin. Raymundo, what language is Baka Kali Kali from? Here, let me put it here.
There might have been a delay there, but so the ask is where is it from? And like it's traced to the Ilocano dictionarios,
Yes.
but it was found in other northern Luzon areas like the Ibanag. They're more associated with Cagayan in the Mountain Province.
Okay.
But the first time I heard about it from someone was we had a neighbor, and his hometown was Agono, Rizal. And he said, that's what we called it in our hometown. And actually that place is nowadays it's only 15-minute drive from Paete, but it just like shows you, it's used in Tagalog speaking areas as well. So that's considered middle Luzon versus northern Luzon. So it had spread, and like this family friend would have heard that term in the 1920s. So it's interesting that it actually existed in that area as well.
Does that correlate or have anything to do with the French documentary where it's mentioned? Have you guys, I'm sure one of you guys must have seen that, right?
We've all seen it, but I'm trying to remember your point. If any, Tim, or I know Tim and Raymundo have seen that documentary from the 1950s from Pampanga.
People reference it because the word is used in there, but it's also, though, it's not used solely. It's in matter of fact, it might
Yeah,
have been.
yes. The interesting thing about the documentary was that yeah, Pampanga is actually a little close to Northern Luzon, so it's just next door.
So it wasn't
So
even like in
I also got
Mindanao.
to just bring up Mahipal
yeah,
Lunia wrote in there. 1912 is the earliest record I've seen of the word Espada Daga. So I'm like, okay, source Mahipal, and we'll wait for him to type it in.
Yeah. I just have one more thing, and I'll leave the word Kali alone. Um, but I thought before Gahe was Villa Bril. I thought was using it, or am I mistaken?
Oh no, so okay, I'm gonna get in trouble for this.
Why don't I get you in trouble? So,
I've had two personal interviews from direct students who connected me. Well, these two interviews were Ben Lagusa, and he was always consistent. It came from, Villa, and he was like, okay, Lihokin Kamai. So like everything that's written in a Sano book, that was exactly what was coming out of his mouth. And I tried to ask him in different ways to see if he would. To be honest, my attempt at the time was to get him to admit to, like, you know, a reframing of the term, but he was consistent with it. But then, having spent time with other elders, it's like, he's a relative of Antonio Illustrissimo. Illustrissimo said, no, I'm the one who taught him. That's what he told me. And he told other people who spent years with him, like, Romeo Macapagal and Yuli Roma, who is still alive. So, and then that, there was no Kali. So, you got to look at those two different things. That's the other hard part for someone like myself, who this is my heritage, is my culture. And then I feel like, it is kind of asshole like sometimes that I'm like poking holes in some people's treasured stories. But it's like, that's a whole separate, I don't know. I don't want, that's a whole separate thing, but that's one of the also hard parts about being a researcher of this stuff.
yeah, okay. Do you guys want to segue into the topic?
Before we do that, I just want to point out that I mean, I don't have anything specific to add to the origin of Kali, but um, both what Raimundo said and what Elrik said could also both be true at the same time, and that's one of the important things to remember. Is a lot of times people want a single answer for a topic that is not going to have a single answer. So these things can change and spread and move around in different locations at different times. Different things can be true at the same time. So it's very difficult to come to a specific answer, and a lot of times create some unnecessary debates and fights over things when multiple things can be true.
I also just saw a note from Ventura, Trinidad, and Chennai, and he writes, it doesn't mean a martial art. And so he's bringing up an important point. Like, I'm trying to remember, I think it's Pappy Dog, Nick Papadakis. He did that little mini documentary, Kali Means to Scrape. And so in certain, including Ilocano, Kali, the root word has to deal with scraping or digging. And the actual term meant like, hey, I'm going to bury you. So like, the other outsiders who might not know the language, like you're saying, like, what are you going to do to him? I'm going to bury him. They're thinking, I'm going to do Kali with him. And then they knew that they were going to do it with, sticks or swords. So then it became associated with the art. But the actual term in certain regional languages is really like, it's associated with fighting, but it's really in the context of the literal translation is, I'm going to bury them. So that's another source of the word.
Okay. Spencer G is saying hi to Tim.
Oh, hi.
Okay. All right. So, Spotty Doug. So, for those who are just jumping in, if you didn't catch the beginning, Elrik asked me like what kind of brought this about, and there was always a genuine interest on my part to find more about, historical context, far as it, how much of this Spanish influence did it exist pre-Spanish times. All those are things that I was curious and wanted to know. Was it used in battle? And then I, be honest, would kind of assumed it was, and they're just by what was being shared with me decades ago. And so, and then in conjunction with that, there was somebody who did suggest, hey, why don't you cover Espada Daga? So between the both, my curiosity, a suggestion, this is what led to this. So yeah. So without further ado, Elric, how you want to proceed?
Well, I'm going to put out some of my personal hypotheses, which may not last this call. And one of them is that most of what we think of as FMA is influenced by 19th century saber work. But also in my research, I'm just going to put it out there. It's like that doesn't explain Espada Daga because any Spanish influence, there wasn't Espada Daga as far as we know in 19th century European sword work. And like Tim can correct me because he might know more about that. But as far as I know, it doesn't exist.
I do believe there was, but it was very rare. I'm digging up my notes right now. I'm gonna check.
Okay. And then one of my other hypotheses that came up was like, the early generations of folks that came to the Philippines, they passed on some Espada Daga. It became part of the culture, and so like something homegrown Espada Daga grew up in the Philippines, and so it's something older than later generations saber influenced FMA. And those are two hypotheses I'll put out there, and we'll see how well it lasts during this presentation and stuff. Anything else, Tim or Raymundo? Should I pull up slides already, or?
Yeah, you can go through.
Okay.
I think Tim has something.
Oh no, I was just gonna say it did exist. It was just rare.
Okay.
Okay, here we go. Just move this over. Here we go. Okay.
Okay. So yeah, Espada Daga means sword and dagger. I can't even see. It doesn't show me my notes. Gosh darn it! But this is, I'm assuming, 16th century, a Spanish sword and dagger set. And then Tim and Raymundo, should I jump into your guys' stuff first, or because I don't have it in a particular order. I'm hearing silence. I'm just gonna jump in. Okay. So actually, okay. Here's the one. So Matt Gallus, who's this researcher in the HEMA community, always gives us little gifts. But in 1578, Don Gonzalo Ronquillo de Peñalosa, he was given a grant to bring 600 men to the Philippines because he was going to be the governor general of the Philippines. So this is still 16th century, early part of the colonial period. A lot of the Philippines were not subjugated yet. And then tells you right here, each of them was equipped with a coat of chainmail. Each was armed with arquebus, sword, and dagger. And then 200 of them were supposed to be married. So they were bringing families with them. And I didn't put it in the slide, but I read something that was like 1604. And it said at that time, 1,000 people had come, 1,000, the Spanish had brought 1,000 people to the Philippines. I'm sorry, I'm getting my numbers mixed up. There was a lot of them that came, but at that time, there was only 1,000 left in the entire islands in 1602. So you can see 600 men come to the Philippines, and then that they were going to be there with arms. That was the Spanish military presence there. And so the natives working with them would have seen that and probably had some influence on them.
Can I ask something?
Yeah, of course. You can ask anytime.
The 1,000 you're referencing, or that were witnessed carrying this, were they more of the aristocrat elite or just military personnel?
military personnel. They were probably actually from different things I've read. There was a couple different governor generals during that time, and what they brought over with them were their troops from the Americas. So they could have had some Spaniards in there, but there were also mestizos, so mixed with the Indios of the Americas, or even they weren't Spanish at all. They were actually Indios from the Americas. And so there was a lot of Nahuatl from Mexico who came to the Philippines, and there's actually still a number of Nahuatl words in different areas, especially Luzon and their languages there. And then also several hundred Peruvian soldiers were also brought to the Philippines. So you get those cultural influences from those two different areas of the Americas in the early days of the Spanish Empire in the Philippines.
That's fascinating. Indios. I mean, that's fast. Actually, Indians were actually brought over as well. That's wow. That's the first time I'm ever hearing this. That's fascinating.
Yeah, something that was kind of interesting regarding the carrying of sword and dagger, to me anyway, is mid 16th century. The development of the swords in Spain were getting to a point where they were getting long enough that it was becoming such a problem that they made various kingdoms made laws about length limits for the blades, and so they established a maximum length for a blade. But as a part of that, a lot of them also um, made laws about the carrying of daggers, and so you weren't allowed to carry a dagger unless you also carried a sword with you.
Interesting. So you could not just solely carry a dagger unless it was accompanied with a. Okay.
Right.
All right.
Yeah, I don't know the reasoning for that. I mean, I can speculate that if you're carrying a dagger, possibly you could hide it easily. You may be up to no good, and
No
you
criminal
know,
activity. Gotcha.
carrying a
Okay.
sword, then everybody knows you're armed, as opposed to,
Yeah, that makes
can't really
sense.
hide that.
Okay.
But it also may have been a way to keep, let's say, poorer people from carrying weapons around. Because if you didn't have a sword or couldn't afford a sword, then you
You
also
were
weren't
carrying a
legally
knife.
allowed to carry a dagger around. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sure it was yeah, as far as the reasoning goes. Yeah. Interesting.
So here, this is more research from Matt Gallas. Espada Daga in Ciudad de Mexico, 1602 to 1654. These are just three examples, but there's actually many. Yeah, three examples of. Um, it says Chino or Chinese man, but at that time period, a Chino Libre was actually a term for any Indio from the Philippines. So we actually don't know if they were actually Chinese or if they were in India, but it mentions that all of these were from Pampanga province, and that was one of the earliest provinces where not only were they allies with the Spanish after they came to Luzon from the Visayas, but then that was like one of the first areas where people actually made lifelong careers serving in the Spanish military. And this is pretty extraordinary because what it's saying here is that sword and dagger was forbidden to non-whites to carry in Mexico City, but licenses were actually granted as exceptions. And this is three examples of three individuals from Pampanga when they were in Mexico there's one 1602, 1653, 1654, where they were allowed to actually carry their sword and dagger with them. We don't know what those look like, what it was, but it's just of note that these people were coming over. And just so people are like, what were they doing there? A good portion of the crews were Indios from the Philippines, and then that was like this was like the Philippines was never profitable for the Spanish Empire, but individuals like government officials, the governor general, they made a lot of money when they were in charge of the Philippines. And sometimes they sent, guards with their shipments, and sometimes those guards were Indios. Like one of the most shocking things for me when I was reading around that time period was that all of the personal guards of the provincial governors were Indios, and they had like, I read things that was explicit about how many they could have, how they were supposed to be trained, how they could include other folks in there, but it was specific. Oh, their guards were Indios, and that was kind of shocking to me that someone as high up as a provincial governor couldn't have Spanish guards or military guarding them. They had to get Indios to do it. That's how few Spaniards were in the Philippines in the 16th and 17th century.
Is that? Do you think there's, as far as the Western is concerned, but regarding that time period, do you think a lot misconceptions? Like, in other words, a lot of us thought maybe there were a lot more.
Oh yeah, I did. You know,
yeah,
we always.
That's what I'm alluding to. I think that if I recall correctly, we were told here. I mean, they were, with the exception of Mindanao, they were all over the place.
Yeah, but they actually weren't.
Right.
Like, I read a military master's, what do you call it, thesis, and the entire thing was about the military conquest of the Philippines, which they dated from 1565 to 1604, and at no point in time during that era, I think, okay, maybe they had up to 2,000 Spaniards in the entire Philippines, but I saw something that was like 1602, and it said there was only 1,000 that were still left. So that's not, and in terms of by that time period, there was already like a ratio of 5-1 of Filipinos serving in. They're no longer allies. They were in the Spanish military.
5-1? Wow.
Yeah.
That's wow. Here's a question that somewhat fits, and it's from Christopher. He's his question is this: I have heard how grandmasters were solicited by the Japan to teach their techniques and were assassinated on their journey there. Is this valid history?
Raymundo, can you tackle this one, please?
Sure.
I probably should have saved it, but
yeah. So in going over that era's historical documentation, World War II, there are actually a lot of documents available from multiple sides. You have Filipinos, you have American documentation. I also went through some Japanese documentation, and there's no mention of that, unfortunately.
No mention.
So yeah, in the version of that story that I heard, it was described that it was a momentous event, like all the grandmasters were paraded and then accorded into the boat. So I believe that if such an event happened, it should have been documented, at least from one of the sides, Filipino, American, Japanese, and unfortunately there's really no documentation of that. So
of that magnitude.
For now, yes, for now, I would write it off as a myth. For now.
Okay.
Yes.
It kind of drives me crazy because, like, my mother's father was a lieutenant during World War II. My mother's mother was recognized, like we have the documents of, she was a guerrilla and recognized by the U.S. government after World War II. My grandfather got the Silver Star and was a Bataan Death March. And then he was also recognized as, later on, he escaped as a POW and was a guerrilla in Leyte. And then but anyway, my point is, there's so much stuff documented. And then when you actually understand what it was like during that time period, the Japanese were really trying to create a new economic sphere. And they were actually trying to create the Filipinos as allies. They didn't get abusive until the end when they realized they were going to lose. I mean, they were abusive in certain ways. Like, yeah, they were literally taking women and turning them into sex slaves in certain areas. But in other areas, like, they were getting the elite, giving them an education. And there's, like, that's recorded, entire boatloads of Philippine elite being sent to Japan to learn Japanese culture. And the idea is they would be the Japanese illustrados bringing Japanese culture back to the Philippines. And one of the most interesting things I saw was a magazine set, and I can't remember where I saw it, but there's I think it's about 10 issues of a magazine that was all Japanese propaganda of showing Japanese and Filipino cooperation during that small time period when the Japanese were in charge of the Philippines. They created a new currency. So the idea that they would take a certain group and then, especially a group that would willingly get on a boat,
Yeah.
it doesn't make any sense given what they were actually spending money on and having people do during that time period.
Far as educating them and exposing them to their culture, right? Why would
Yeah.
they
And,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
and when you talk to, you read the stuff about the folks who were actually guerrillas during that time, it's like they didn't care about people who had, a skill to fight with a stick or a bolo. They worried about people who knew how to blow things up, people who had guns. They hated it when they actually did get killed by, guerrillas sneaking out and killing off a couple Japanese, because that is well documented and recorded, but
Huh.
it just doesn't
So
match
so
what we know that time period.
yeah. Sorry, I'm lagging. But I think an important thing to note was that within that time period, the lineages weren't exactly, they weren't united. It was a time when Juego Todo was still being done. So there's also very little possibility that the grandmasters would agree to, interface with each other and be hosted by a foreign entity. So I don't think that's highly probable within the FMA context of that time.
Mm.
Filipinos are rather, to use the word quote unquote secretive, and they will not willingly give away their fighting art. Another interesting thing is that it's been really difficult finding the explicit mention of Filipino martial arts, arnis, eskrima in historical documentation, even up to World War II era. So you would get a lot of descriptions of Filipinos fighting this way with the bolo, or having great prowess with the bolo. But the mention of FMA, explicit mention, was actually very, very rare. So yeah, because I think a lot of people have this misconception that FMA is very well documented. Actually, it's difficult. It's like sifting through breadcrumbs and trying to piece together clues on finding the mention, finding the movement, finding the use of weapons in historical documentation. It's yeah. So as one of my mentors said, the 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 Filipino martial arts practitioners who fought among the guerrillas in the different wars, they weren't actually the majority. They were a very small minority, because there's also a misconception that when a Filipino goes out to the field fighting, he would have been likely versed in FMA. That's a great misconception, because
Yeah, like you're right. Yeah, I could see. Okay,
yeah, yeah.
wow. It's so interesting though. Like again, another misconception. I mean, we've been told over here just how terrible the Japanese were to the Filipinos during that time of occupation, World War II. Nothing to the extent, not even close, that there was Filipinos being over, being educated and this, you know pollination, if you will. Nothing, far from it, actually. You know what I mean? Just horror stories. Just
And both of them are true,
yeah.
because they really, those horror stories are true. They're very well documented.
Yes.
It was so bad in Manila, and the Japanese so entrenched themselves, and they were killing so many civilians that there's like one city in Europe, and that's the only city other than Manila. Like that's the number one city in terms of bombing that wasn't nuked, and the
Mm.
second city with the most bombing for all of World War II is Manila, and it was actually America bombing Manila to help get the Japanese out. They felt like that was the only
Only
way
way to get them out of there, right?
to
Yeah.
get them out of there, and so, and it was like, my grandfather had nightmares, screaming nightmares into into his 80s. So that's how traumatic World War II was for him. I mean,
Yeah, I
this was in
can.
the 1990s that he was still having nightmares
He was
from the
still home.
1940s. That's 50 years ago.
Another question came in, guys.
Sure.
This is from Kurt. Since we are talking about WW2 FMA guerrilla action, what do you all know about the FMA being taught to the U.S. Marine Corps raiders in Hawaii?
I'm actually not familiar with that. Any either of you or
No,
No.
the the only possible source that I have on this would be Master Virgil Apostol, because he has documentation on the Northern Luzon, Hawaii FMA practitioners who may have participated in World War II. So I don't have specifics right now, and he's about to come out with his book about this. So I think, yeah, I can't answer
Mm,
that currently. Yeah, I'll leave
this,
that to him to answer.
this is pretty much true by Maynard. I mean, yeah, a lot of propagating happened over here in the States for sure. This is interesting. The 50s, yeah, karate and yeah, evolving. Okay. In the 1900s. I thought it was okay. All right. So yeah, some digression, but hey, this is all fantastic stuff. So
So to
we
kind of tie back to something Elrik was saying about the understanding of how few Spaniards there were in the Philippines, and related to the Japanese coming in and wanting the Filipinos to help. With the Spanish, the thing to remember is that there's not just like nowadays FMA masters are propagating falsehoods. This happens all over the place and all the time. And so like if you just think about the Spanish in Mexico when they came to and the myth is that they came in, there was like 300 Spanish or whatever, and they came and they defeated the whole Aztec empire.
mm,
It's total bullshit. It's just you know people wanting to romanticize what happened. What the Spanish would do is they would come and land somewhere, figure out who's in charge, figure out who hated the people who were in charge, and then they would make a deal with them, and then they would go and conquer. So they would use the native populations against each other, right? The divide and conquer. They were
Exactly.
masters of that. They did it all over the Americas. They did it in the Philippines, even though they weren't supposed to be in the Philippines. The Philippines was supposed to be um, Portuguese. The Pope divided the world between Spain and Portugal, and Portugal was actually on the Philippines was on the Portuguese side, not the Spanish side. So the Spanish, this was before Panama Canal, before steamships and everything. So it is a long, long way to get from Spain to the Philippines on the other side of the world. And you're not going to sail all the way around South America to come up. So you're going to have to sail over to Mexico. You're going to have to go all the way across Mexico. And then you're going to have to, catch a ride like from Acapulco all the way to Manila. And not many people wanted to do that, so it's not like there were hordes of Spanish coming over to um, the Philippines. And it's not that there was just a few brave Spanish with their advanced technology and their ridiculously fabulous fencing that just destroyed all of the natives and conquered everybody. They made deals with the locals, and they used them to fight against each other in order to gain control over the
mm,
Philippines. So it makes a lot of sense, and then like I didn't think too much about it until Errol came out with the numbers, and there was a big explosion of population in the 19th century, later 19th century, which corresponds with when steamships came out. And so it was a lot easier to get to different places. And the Spanish Empire was kind of on its way out at that point as well. So
mm,
it's very important to remember that there were a lot of natives that were, regardless of where the Spanish were, they were using the natives to do a lot of their work. And one thing that's important is, especially with the Filipinos, like you'll hear a lot of accounts of how, like Raimundo was saying, they're really great with their with the bolo. or they're really skilled, they're really brave, or whatever. So there's a lot of things that come up where it's like, well, the Spanish came and they taught these Filipinos how to fight. Like, that's, for me, that makes no sense. If I'm taking place of a Spaniard and I come to the Philippines and I say, okay, these are the people that I have allies with, I'm not going to say, give me all your people that don't know how to fight. Let me teach them how to fight.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Give me your people that know how to fight. Get it over here. Yeah, go fight for me. I'm not going to spend my time trying to teach you how to fight.
Yeah.
That's inefficient. I'm going to let the people that know how to fight go ahead and do their fighting.
Those are the ones that are going to be jumping on the ships and going to the new lands, right?
Right.
Yeah, no, totally makes sense.
I noticed we're getting some questions that are going to continue us into tangents. But
I know.
We want to say, so we'll have to scuttle those for now and get back to Espada Daga.
Yeah.
But in one of my conversations with Raymundo, we were talking about how there's actually different types of cultures in the Philippines, and different kinds of, like, not all of them were warrior cultures, but for those that were, their practice was to go to different areas, raid, take slaves, bring them back. This is well documented in Spanish accounts, that I've talked about before. The William Henry Scott's book, Philippines in the 16th Century. I think the name of the book is Barangay. Anyway, what they would do back then is they would often find new allies and go raid together. So all of a sudden the Spanish come with, wow, they have bigger boats or different boats from what we've ever seen. And also needs to be said is the Philippines already had cannons, and they also had certain cannons that really impressed the Spanish. Like, they had certain types of swivel cannons on smaller boats that could literally sail circles around the Spanish ships and then fire on them, and they couldn't fire on those Philippine ships. But when the Spanish came, they were also impressive in other ways. They had armor that they hadn't seen. They had swords and spears, and then also firearms they'd never seen. I mean, the arquebus is the equivalent of a shotgun, and then what's the other one? Matchlock, or anyway, and then there's the other one that was equivalent of a rifle. So that was new technology in the Philippines. So when the Spanish said, hey, come raid with us, that fit right in with Filipino culture. And so it was easy, like, hey, on that other island, the Spanish are there, let's all go raid with them. And like, when the Spanish first came into Manila, they had anyway, again, I'm sorry, I can't remember the number because I wasn't planning to talk on this, but the large ratio of allies saying, like, let's raid with them. So it was natural. Like, they didn't even really have to convince. The Spanish were able to fit right into the ecosystem of the warrior cultures in the Philippines. It's not like they conquered them. It's like they didn't even realize they're getting conquered. And it was like this evolution of, the Spanish are starting to set up a structure. And then certain people within some of those tribal groups that were allies already then start to take in the roles of, like, oh, wow, we're already a Datu, but now we're, the Gobernorcillo, we're going to be in charge of this area. We're going to get these other benefits. So it's this slowly enculturation. And one of the other hypotheses is, like, what we think of as FMA today was birthed inside of those communities that were part of the Spanish infrastructure, as opposed to those other groups that stayed separate. And then there's some slides about that later. I just have one question for Raymundo and Tim. I don't know if this is a slide that I mistakenly put in here, but you guys see this? Is this one of you guys, or did you want to talk about it? Because I don't even know what this slide is for. Sorry. Or should I just skip it? Okay.
This is slide 4, right, Elrik? This is slide 4.
I can't tell with how it's on my computer right now. Sorry.
Okay. No
I'll go to the next
slide
one.
5.
Yeah. So yesterday. Did you want to say something, Raymundo?
Yeah. I think it's also important at this point before we go to this to Andrea Rolio's article. I would just like to emphasize that since we've been talking about Espada y Daga and we have an FMA centric audience, that when we try to do research, even though Espada y Daga is an accepted component of Filipino martial arts nowadays, we also have to keep in mind that when it's mentioned in historical documents, it may not necessarily pertain to the fighting art automatically. So it may just be the artifact by itself. Like I think I mentioned in a previous call that it's a nobility indicator. So having Espada y Daga does not equate to having the art of using it or even knowing an art of using it. It may just be a nobility indicator for some or for most. We don't have the exact numbers now. So I just like to emphasize that part because it's something that's been going on, that when you have a Filipino weapon or something associated with the Filipino weapon, you would automatically attach this to Filipino martial arts. So there's such a thing as just having the weapon, having the knowledge to use it, but it may not be FMA. It may just be simple knowledge, experience of using it, or I may just be carrying it for nobility purposes as an indicator of rank. So yeah, that's just what I wanted to emphasize.
Ramona, I'd also like you to touch on, because we earlier we talked about research, but we didn't talk about the researchers who've been dealing with the material record for the last 30 years. So one of the like Raymundo has done 2 articles recently for, was it the Rapper? It's a newspaper here in the Philippines that's now all online. But he's been introducing a new generation to our antique blades, and then also doing work with. There's basically two different groups of researchers when it comes to Philippine blades. The modern folks are doing field research in finding living Panday traditions. So a lot of people say like, "Oh, we're preserving the Philippine blades; they don't exist anymore." Yeah, there's some that have literally died. There's some old stuff that's gone. But like for someone like me, who's been into FMA for 30 plus years, I was shocked to see certain blade types still had Pandai, the smiths, who could make like amazing blades. Some of them that still handle like antiques. It was like shocking to me because like so many times I'd gone to certain areas, you know, in the 90s or other times, and talking to other people, we thought those blades were dead, but then like, oh, now some of those blades we find out, oh, there's still a living tradition there. So if you could talk a little bit about the blade researchers and how that relates to FMA and
Sure,
Raimundo.
sure, 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 sure. Sorry if I may have some delay. So for the local scene, there's this group. They're actually on Facebook. The name is Filipino Traditional Blades. So what's interesting about this group is that they're mostly outdoorsmen, like survival guys, camping, trekking guys. So most of them don't have any background in FMA, which is great because when they go blade hunting, that's their term for hunting traditional blades. They have no bias. They have no FMA experience to speak of. So when they approach the panday, when they approach the blacksmith, when they approach the people who use these blades, they're not going to say, "Oh, do you have an FMA style? Do you have a lineage?" They don't do that. They just go like, "Oh, what do you use this blade for? Who did you learn? How did you learn how to make this blade, for example?" So these researchers are responsible for unearthing the large store of traditional blades which are still being made today. Some of them still look like vintage samples, and very very few still look like the antiques. I mean, that's antiques are a long time ago, more than 100 years ago. But the important part here is that they're still being made, and people are still using them, whether they're FMA or not.
Raimundo, can you
And
qualify
the yeah,
um,
sure.
modern, vintage, and antique in the blade research community? Because it's not the same for
Sure,
outsiders.
sure. So, with regard to that, there's actually different views regarding modern vintage and antique, but I hold to the interpretation of my foremost mentor, Style Ala, because he uses basically what the museums use, which is vintage would be something from World War II era onwards, and then modern would be something already like 1980s, and then antiques would be before World War II, so roughly 100 years ago, more or less. Because I know of some people who say, when they say vintage, that's 30 years ago. So for me, that's the modern. And then some people who say World War II antique, but for me that's vintage. So there's a great subjectivity in this area, but it made sense when Style asked me oh, is your 96-year-old grandmother already antique? Would you consider her as an antique? How about your 70-year-old dad? Would you consider him as an antique or as vintage? And I'm like, okay, the museum classification does make sense from a human POV. Yeah. So that's for the local scene. You have a Filipino traditional blades group, and then there are also dedicated researchers like Lawrence Lasco, who are doing academic research. Professor Bot Hocano, and then in the States, in the United States, there's actually a very low key group. Um, Combate Eskrima Original, that's headed by Style Ala. They've been working for decades. They've been tirelessly poring over all sorts of research material or all sorts of documentation. They've actually been my mentors and also the top consultants for Filipino traditional blades and other local researchers. So it's actually ironic that they're very low profile and based in the States, but they actually know more than the local guys like me. So they've been the one who have been jobbing breadcrumbs for the current era of researchers. So yeah, you have an interface of academics and elders who are based in the United States and who've done their own share of field research decades ago. And then you have the local scene, young researchers like me, who are trying to make sense of all the data which is suddenly being accessed via the internet and via mentors abroad. Yeah. So that's basically the blade research scene
And I just
from
got to
my
bring it up,
POV. Sure,
Raymundo. How
sure.
many antiques have you actually refurbished and repaired?
So I've been really fortunate that old collectors have entrusted me to restore and at times do trading with their blades. So from the local scene, I'd say about 300 to 400 with regards to long blades and about the same amount for the small blades. So these are mostly Moro blades. About 70% Moro blades, 20% Visayan, 10% Luzon. But then I've also had experience going to museums and other collections holding the blades at times if it's permitted because some museums don't allow, holding. So all in all, probably above 1,000, yeah, above 1,000 blades. So yeah, I've also restored, thanks to the guidance of the CEO guys. I've also restored a lot of blades from from all over the archipelago. Yeah, Luzon, Visayas, and Mindanao. So I've detached hilts. I've seen how it works inside. I've seen the infamous rat tail tang, which is actually not rat tail. Most of the antiques have actually very fat tangs, which I would qualify as almost being hidden tang. So yeah, I've I've had a lot of steel. Yeah.
And that'll come into play when we get into Espada Daga. Any
Yeah.
questions, Dean, before we get into the document that kind of puts us in a whole different direction from Andrea Rollo?
No, not at all.
Do you want to introduce your bullet points so that we don't go through the thing line by line? Because that would be a call in itself, Tim.
Yeah, it'd take way too long, line by line. So, like Elrik said, Andrea Rollo posted a link to this, so you can find it. If you can read Spanish, then you can check it out. But it's actually written by a Filipino for a magazine, just written in Spanish from 1925, so almost 100 years old. And essentially, it's arguing about whether or not Filipino Espada y Daga is um, one, if it is genuinely Filipino or not, and then two, whether it's better or worse than European fencing. So this kind of argument that a lot of people have is is pretty old, which was surprising that they were arguing about the same things. So he says that there's basically the argument is that the sword and dagger espada y daga doesn't exist in European fencing. Um, and that it's better than European fencing because European fencing only uses the single sword or the saber, and having a sword and a dagger together is obviously better. And so the author goes through and says that it can't be pre-Hispanic because of the name, and he lists several different things that have Spanish names, but then also the name in Tagalog or whatever the local language is that he's referencing, and says that that doesn't exist for Espada y Daga. They call it Espada y Daga, so obviously it couldn't have existed before because the name is Spanish. So his argument is that it doesn't make any sense for Espada y Daga um, to be genuinely Filipino because of that, because the words are in Spanish, which is something that is very commonly repeated today. You know, something that's very it comes to a lot of arguments, right? And so I'd kind of like to pause there and get Elrik and Raymundo's feedback on just that bit.
Well, one thing that's important to say, because I read, like I said before, Inosanto's book was not written in a vacuum. It was a civil rights era. This was also not written in a vacuum. Interesting that this was written in Spanish, and that at some point the Americans actually had to create a law banning Spanish publications to actually stop the propagation of the language in the Philippines amongst the elite. But the point is, at this point in time, it was already talking about the transition from an American colony to a commonwealth that would eventually become its own country. So this was happening in this space of Filipinos trying to redefine themselves and redefine their past. Also, it's interesting that at that time period, the Americans actually wrote a lot of translated Spanish documents, like Glenn Robinson's, as documents showing the Spanish greed and incompetence. So, like, a lot of the benefits of the Spanish colonial period was not just downplayed. What was highlighted was all the incompetence and corruption that existed during that era. And I feel like that's another reason why, for the Americans, their main hero that they want to push for the Filipinos was Rizal, versus someone like Bonifacio, who was like, get rid of all the Europeans. The Americans didn't want to have anything to do with that. Raymundo?
I just like to ask Tim a question, because we're dealing with a Spanish document here, which was written by a Filipino, right? So there's always been this conception that since FMA has a lot of Spanish terms in different lineages, does it really follow that these came from Spanish fighting arts? These terms, are they also present from that point of view?
Yeah. So Elrik, if you go to I think it's the very last slide. There's I put together a bunch of terms that and I don't know how well people can see it. So
can we make that the only image, Dean, for a moment?
Yeah, I'm gonna have to drop everybody down, but we can do it.
Please.
So
I'm also gonna get water. I'll be back.
The only problem though is he's not gonna be able to. Here's the thing though. I could drop. So who's gonna speak on it, and I'll drop everybody else down. Sorry.
I'll speak on it.
Okay. All right then. We're all gonna go away for. It'll widen things out. So.
Okay. Yeah. It shouldn't take too long.
Let me just get myself out here.
Yeah. So if you all can see that, the terms on the left-hand column are this isn't an exhaustive list in either case, but on the left-hand column, it's terms in Spanish that exist in Filipino martial arts that also exist in Spanish fencing, so Spanish fencing terminology. And on the right, you'll see a lot more Spanish terms that those are ones that are a part of Spanish fencing that do not exist in Filipino martial arts as far as I could determine. And this is not again, it's not an exhaustive list. These are very fundamental terminologies in Spanish fencing. So if there's any like HEMA practitioners, any like destreza, or later like Spanish saber, or earlier the eskrima común practitioners on here, you can recognize some of these. They're very, very fundamental. And so, like the name for a cut is missing. The ways that you would hold, the names of techniques, or ways that you would establish yourself, the guard that you would have, different movements that you would make, different steps that you would make, things that are very, very fundamental to the art. Those are, a lot of them are listed over there on the right. On the left, you can see some of them that are common. So obviously Espada y Daga, Esgrima or Eskrima, those obviously kind of mean the same thing. Arnés and Arnis. I believe Andreas put out part of his thesis, little snippets where he talks about Arnés. The interesting thing about Arnés is that Arnés is, it means, like you hear a lot, oh, it means harness, or it means armor, or it means, various things. It does. It means all of those. Arnés is like gear. Like it's the stuff that you use for a thing. It's not terribly specific as to what it is. It is used in Spanish fencing to talk about the things that you hold. So like sword and dagger, those are arnés, but almost always it's arneses, the plural form. So multiple of these things. So it could be sword and shield. It could be the shield, the dagger. It could be a cloak. It could be another shield. It's not specific as to what it is. So they don't use the term arnés de mano. But when you look, it kind of makes sense why you would say arnés de mano, because arnés could mean a bunch of things, including armor. So when you say arnés de mano, that means specifically the gear that would be held in your hands. So that's one of the things that's fairly common and very interesting. Things like sable and estocada. Sable is not terribly common in Filipino martial arts, but it is sometimes used, and same with estocada. Usually they're not named for the same way that they are in Spanish. So sable is the saber, but then you may call the style sable, or same thing with estocada. Estocada means thrust, but estocada is another word for the Filipino martial arts of a particular thing. So might be they call it eskrima, maybe they call it arnis, maybe they call it sable, they call it estocada. These kind of things make sense. Some places call it baston, or they'll call it broquil. Those are the names for the implement. So baston is a stick. Broquil is like a carved stick in a sword shape. So it seems to be a fairly common thing to name the art after the implement, and even today you can hear, I've heard Filipinos, they refer to like the sticks or whatever that you use. That's your arnis, grab your arnis. They're referring to the sticks. They're not, referring to the style, but it's kind of interchangeable. And then contra just means counter. That's a fairly common one, but it's used in both. So it's worth being listed there. And gaño means deception or trickery, right? It's used pretty much the same way. Retirada is retreat. So some arts will talk about retirada as a kind of backwards movement, and some of the later styles of fencing would talk about retirada as a backward movement. It is a military command as well. It means to retreat or to withdraw. And so these are all kind of general things. The last one's very interesting, rompido, because rompido means broken, but it's an archaic form of the word for broken. In modern days, now roto is the word for broken. Rompido is like if you didn't know how to speak Spanish terribly well, you might think that rompido is a word, but it's actually roto. It's irregular. So it's interesting that it exists in some Filipino styles, or they'll say rompida. And one of the terribly interesting things about it is it's an up and down movement, right? It's cutting up and down or hitting up and down, and it's in Spanish fencing, especially in the older style of Spanish fencing. They'll say romper, which is um, the infinitive form of the verb rompido is broken. Romper is to break, and so what it refers to is an upward motion of the sword, either with either edge of the sword, depending on the style, in order to break the opponent's guard, the position of their sword. So you're hitting their sword out of the way, either because it's in position or because they're thrusting at you or whatever, and you'll hit it out of the way and you'll come back down and hit. Um, it's not clear to me how those are, if those two are related at all, or if it's just from a common sense of the word, because most of these words here, like contra, engaño, retirada, they're more in the general sense. So usually when you find Spanish words like that, it's more of a common sense and not usually technical vocabulary from Spanish fencing. But over on the right, you can see tons of different technical vocabulary that does not actually exist in the Filipino martial arts that I've ever even heard of, let alone seen personally. So that's about it, Dean. You can bring us all back up, and hopefully that answers some of Raimundo's question.
Thank you, Tim. It's really interesting how few terms were actually ported over as compared to, the voluminous vocabulary of Spanish fencing on the right side. Yeah.
That was fascinating. Tim, that was fascinating. Thank you.
One of the things that I'm trying to see how I can introduce this topic, but one thing is, like, if we look at FMA today, in the Philippines, the first to go kind of mainstream was modern arnis, which was taught in the schools in different parts of the Philippines, and then there was WCAF. So someone asked earlier about, like, why did FMA become popular in the Philippines? It was actually part of the nation building during the Marcos era. Ferdinand Marcos, through General Ver, really promoted Filipino martial arts during his presidency and helped bring a lot of old men in different arts that probably, to be honest, might have died off if it wasn't given a venue to be out there in the public eye. Like, if you look at videos of tournaments or gatherings in those time periods, it's kind of amazing to see some of, like, the largest basketball stadiums of the time period, thousands of people screaming, or look like, they're cheering in the stands for these FMA tournaments. And it was like, wow, what a different time period. What's my point about that? There's the FMA that's documented, and then there's FMA that, like, there's a lot of systems that no one even knew about until someone actually brought it to the forefront. And so while there's the Spanish fencing that was documented and that became very famous, like Destreza, Tim's like one of the few people who have actually translated what few other writings there were on the Eskrima Commune that exists. But I assume there was other stuff. There's probably stuff that also developed in the Americas that was never written about. And that's the stuff that would have gone to the Philippines and been shared and spread around. But I have to be honest and say, this is 100% speculation on my point. There's nothing to back up what I'm saying right now, even though to my mind it makes sense.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it is possible. One of the interesting things about looking at the comparison between the Filipino martial arts and Spanish fencing is that they're kind of dead opposite. not stylistically, but as far as what we have. Spanish fencing, very, very well documented, going back to the 16th, 15th century up until now. And so we can track it through history, how it changed, the technically how it worked, the reasoning behind a lot of things. They wrote a lot. There's a ridiculous amount of books that they made. So just I happen to have this next to me. So this is a bibliography of Spanish fencing that was done by a researcher, and so it's that thick. It's huge. There's let me check. There's almost 500 different entries in here of different books that were written on Spanish fencing in the period, like throughout the years, not like modern books that were written. That's a separate issue. So we have that, but then it died. There was no, like, around the end of the 19th century, it died out. It was replaced, and we have the exact opposite with Filipino martial arts. We don't have a lot of historical documentation. We, like Elrik was saying, we have styles now that we don't know. They're just popping up, that have been there hidden, that we didn't see them before, and we don't. So it's still alive, and we can see it. We can watch it evolving in real time. But when it comes to historical documentation, like Raymundo was saying earlier, it's very, very rare. And as far as like a technical description of what it was like, we don't really have anything before the middle of the 20th century. So it's a very difficult thing to compare, and so we have to have um, a lot of speculation as to, well, what was it like, because there's no real overlap. And so, for instance, this is another part where, like, I'm my bias is that the uh, the the Spanish writings on fencing were very verbose. They wrote a lot and a lot of detail. So, like what Elric was saying, is that there could be these other undocumented styles. It's possible, but for me, I wouldn't say they don't exist. I would say it's a very low possibility, because that them having escaped the notice. A lot of these books were written um, published in the Americas. Like, they were published. There were books published in Mexico, books published in Peru. There's actually a couple books where they're arguing about this style that Destreza came over to South America, and it changed slightly. And another famous author was denigrating it, and he was calling it Destreza Indiana. It's the Indian Destreza, but really it was just Spanish Destreza with some really small differences that they would argue about. So it did come over. It was here. They did talk about the styles that existed in this area. So it wasn't exhaustive. It wasn't extensive. So you can't rule it out and say, well, we don't have documentation, therefore it didn't exist, because that's not correct. Because otherwise, all these styles that we don't know, these Filipino styles that we don't know about now, we would have been saying those don't exist. And some people did say those don't exist, and now we see them.
A few questions came in. If you guys wanted, we can push them ahead or not. One question is, let's go back up a bit here. Kurt would like to know where he can get access to these documents, if that's possible.
You can write to me. Anyone can write to me, and then I'll
Okay.
point them towards some of that stuff, because a lot of the stuff that we're talking about exists in the Hema Philippines group, and I'll just teach them how to search for it. But then
Okay.
there might be stuff like, oh, I don't know about that, ask Raymundo, or I'll send them to Tim. But they can write to me first.
All right, and also, here's another question from Richard Packman.
Narfils during the Marcos era. If they want to know more about Narfil, Grandmaster Rene Johnson, that's the person. I would say he's one person that you could talk to and ask him about that era.
And
Also, Yuli Romo and Romy Makapakal, but I don't know how if they'll get back to people.
okay, why is there such a scarcity of documentation of FMA? This is from Alvin.
Well, the documentation was from that that exists on the Philippines is from those in power during the Spanish era, so it wasn't seen as an important thing. I mean, it was just like, okay, they have people, they learned how to fight, but what was more important was how well they could fight on ships, how well they could fight with guns, or and actually, here's the honest truth, and I talked about in one of my earlier ones, like what is actually documented is people fighting with spears. So it's like,
Yes.
like when we talk about, oh yeah, the Spanish priests actually did, they came, how do I say this? There was an era in the 19th century where it was just looked really bad for the Spanish. The number of Spanish priests and people in the Visayas, like thousands per year, were like captured and taken to Holo as slaves in other areas in Mindanao, and then it was basically the Spanish priests who organized them into localized militias, and like set up like in Lord of the Rings, the watchtowers. Like as soon as the Moro ships were seen, they start banging on the church bells, light a fire, and then all the islands could see it, and they could say, okay, everyone's getting ready, because one group would see it when they're like maybe an hour away, half hour away, but then they would see the things, and so like now that entire region is ready. When the Moros came up, they're ready to fight them. But when you read how they actually fought, everything that I've seen says the priests were training them to fight with spears and shields. I've yet to come across a single thing that said they were actually trained with swords or sticks or anything that looks like modern FMA. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. It exists in oral traditions, but in terms of what the Spanish documented, I haven't seen it yet, and I've
Yeah,
been looking.
the same goes for me. All the Spanish documentation I've gone over, it's always the spear that's mentioned, and the Spanish even took care to note people who were exceptional with the spear. Like they noted the Boholanos, so these are people from Bohol, an area in the Philippines, because they were exceptional with the spear versus the Campilan of the Moro. So there's actually historical documentation of that. Um, a lot of the mentions are really of spears, whether it's sharpened, it's makeshift spears. Sometimes they just sharpen the bamboo, and then other times it's actually the metal point, the sharp spear, I call it. So yeah, that was actually the standard weapon for the Filipinos who were allied with Spain, the Filipino troops. I totally agree with Elric that that would have been the bulk of their training, because spears were indispensable in the battlefield up to a certain point in time.
And then like 19th century Spanish fencing also includes what do you call it? Bayonet fencing, and that's actually what documented. And you can see a lot of pictures of them, armed with going to the field with rifles with really long bayonets on them.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah, it's important, and Raimundo makes this point as well, like to differentiate between war and battle and dueling. And
Do you,
so
want, do
this
you want me
is
to pull up that slide already, guys? Or
uh,
Yes.
yeah, yeah. So from the Spanish side, just very quickly before I can let
Sure, sure, sure.
Raimundo go into it. Uh, the Spanish didn't run into war with their swords, and certainly not with a sword and a dagger to come and fight people. If they their main weapon back in the day was the spear, along with guns, and they were renowned for developing that. What do we call pike and shot now? Pike being a very very long spear, and then originally crossbows with it, but then more and more firearms developing with it, and so that was their main thing. And when firearms advanced more, eventually the spear kind of started to fall out with the introduction of the bayonet. But there was I really like the way one of these mid 17th century fencing authors put it. He says that the sword is first in peace, but it's the last resort in war, because you don't want to be down to your sword. Your sword is a sidearm for, in case something else goes wrong. You break your pike, then you can draw your sword. Or if somebody gets into close combat and you're a musketeer, you got an arquebus, then you can draw your sword, or for very specialized uses. But by and large, out there on the battlefield, you don't want a bunch of people trying to run out and duel. You want people organized in a group who can move as a group and follow commands and fight, and they're not doing that with swords.
I would speculate that some of the technology, like the Spanish were known for the terciados in the 16th century, whereas like, they're pike formations, but they also had, sometimes they would throw someone with a montante, which was like a claymore, a really long Spanish sword. Things could have developed like that in the Philippines using the weapons there, because we do see paintings of people going into battle with spears and shields, and then right next to them are those would have been militia, and then right next to them in those same paintings are folks fighting with rifle and bayonet. So they would find ways to work together. And then it was interesting, other people going into battle carrying ladders because they needed that to enter the moral cotas or the moral fortification. So they did have, the Spanish actually trained people in systemized ways of fighting as groups. And my speculation is like, yeah, people, if they were working together, if sportsmanship was their thing, things would have been transferred and shared. But how much? It's unfortunately in the domain of speculation. And I mean, I'd love to talk to people on one-on-one, but saying it publicly, it's like, I already know some of the stuff will be proven wrong at some point.
Yeah. So
Uh,
a question. Again, because I don't want to get derailed here, but you guys can tell me if you want to just pass up on it or continue. It's up to you guys. We're at the last one.
Okay, so I saw someone says sword is an authority, a symbol of leadership in any country. Filipinos have their own. That's Sir Alvin Gacos, or Father Gacos. Actually, when you look at the old documentation, especially the old dictionarios, there were I think it was like someone actually did a count. I think it was William Henry Scott. 200 words in the different dictionarios relating to spears, and how in Spanish pre-colonial times the prestige weapon of the Filipinos was the spear in most cases. Now it's interesting that what's become in the narrative are those rare accounts, like there's some old Ilocano stories, and there's also some old stories from the large stories preserved in Negros and Panay, where they talk about the Campilan or different swords. But what's much more documented by the Spanish is that the original stories were about the mighty spears of different warriors in area. So it's like that was the old prestige weapon, and then we also know that that weapon was still used up until the coming of the Americans, and the Moros were still using the spear against the Americans. So some groups still use them into the 20th century. Doesn't mean that we didn't have, there's plenty of accounts of also the Tulosanes, which are like the bandits. The what are the folks in Samar called Raymundo, and then also the Moros. They were, there's renowned Spanish and American documents of one slice, and it's like cutting the torso from shoulder to pelvis, or like boron cuts going through two torsos. That's people were pretty dangerous with our traditional blades, but it's also we need to give credit to also the renowned spearmanship that's also well documented. People Indios killing people with accuracy, being able to hunt deer with a spear from horseback, or like what they did with their kills with throwing spears, but also fighting with spears.
Um, is it okay if
Yeah, please,
I
anytime.
interrupt? Yeah, yeah. I mean, since we're on this slide, duel versus
D,
war.
why don't we, Dean? Why don't you
Du-
get rid of us and just have
Sure.
Raymundo in the
No.
slide?
Oh, he's got to show something. Oh, I thought you were okay. He's got something to show.
Yeah, we're gonna go. He's gonna go over some of the slides. So, and I'll
Sure.
Raymundo, just tell me which slide to move to.
Sure, sure.
All right, I will lower us. Okay.
Okay. So, I actually have a personal theory that Filipino martial arts has more to do with dueling rather than war or battlefield usage. So,
Hold on,
here,
Dean. Can you get rid
sure,
of
sure.
me because people can't see the.
There. So, yeah. So, my personal theory has to do with these definitions. And what what I think all of us have observed with FMA is that there's very little classical knowledge on how to use a spear. So that's the first point of my theory. If FMA was a battlefield art, it would have preserved in some way spear usage and then later on bayonet usage. But we don't see that. What we see are a lot of stick work, a lot of bolo work, a lot of sword work. So I think it also has to be mentioned that even Espada y Daga, given our topic, as I've read in some Spanish documentation, it seems to have been a weapon that someone would have brought along in a dueling match. So just correct me if I'm wrong, Tim. But but it was always mentioned that in duels it was expected that you're attired with Espada y Daga. So and you usually use a sword for duels. I've not yet heard of a duel in a Filipino context or even in a Spanish context wherein they use spears. So it was always almost always the sword that was mentioned in a duel, and sometimes it was unarmed. Another thing, aside from the absence of spear in FMA, was that I'm sure all of you have noticed that FMAers, modern FMAers, tend to gravitate towards longer weapons. Like, everyone wants the 21-inch blade sword, everyone wants a 25-inch blade sword. So that for me is very telling of a dual scenario, because what most people don't realize is that when you go to the field, when you're in a real war, if you're in a masked bolo rush, which is actually a legitimate tactic mentioned in historical documentation. So when you're a bolo man and you're doing a bolo rush, there are actually many of you who are going to charge head onto the enemy. If you are using a very long sword, like 21 inch, 25-inch, if you do a horizontal cut, you're gonna end up cutting down your teammates, your allies. So these long swords are better off when fighting in duels. When you're doing a mass bowler rush, you're better off using a standard length or a spear. Standard length bolo would be around, let's say, 14-inch blade, 16-inch blade, and or you would have to use a spear, which is of course prime battlefield weapon. So it's also mentioned here that in dueling, it's a one-on-one engagement, and you have win parameters, which is very much reflected in even in our modern day FMA sparring. So that alone, those indicators alone, for me, would be the main points in my theory that what we have today, FMA, is mainly about dueling. And then you have on the war side, there's a lot of historical documentation, as I've said earlier, of Boloman Rush, which was used by the Katipunan, which was used by the First Republic, which was used by even by the Pulahan insurgents in Visayas. So in historical documentation, it was very specific. They were taught how to do the rush, when to do the rush. Someone would give a signal, or they would hide in ambush. They would pretend to be dead when they would suddenly all rise up and rush in jungle terrain. So these tactics, we don't have this in FMA. There's actually it's not being taught nowadays. There's no classical mention of it on, oh, this how you do an ambush. Oh, this how you do a mass baller rush. So that's something which is markedly missing in FMA nowadays. Yeah. And then Elric, if it's okay to go to slide 11 and 12. Slide 11 first, yes.
or back.
Back, 2 slides back, sorry. Yeah, there. Thank you. So yeah, I just like to clarify that as we mentioned earlier, when you say Filipino, the since it's Filipino martial arts, the term was first used for Spaniards who were born in the Philippines. So they were also called insulares, and they were considered as a lower class of Spaniards as compared to the peninsulares, those who were born in Spain. But the well-to-do Filipinos, such as Jose Rizal, use this term to refer to themselves. So it was actually an adopted term because the original term was Españoles Filipinos to refer to the Spaniards who were born here. But the Indio adopted this term to themselves. So you have the usage of this term coming in only late 1800s already. And since these Indio were all Catholics, as the Spaniards were, I think it's very important to emphasize that when you say Filipino martial arts, these are arts originating from areas which were predominantly Catholic. So this is in order to have a distinction between Filipino martial arts and indigenous fighting arts, which is, I think, on the next slide, Elric. Okay. Yeah, there. Thank you so much. So the IPs, according to their research, they already had a distinct culture during pre-colonial times. We all know this because they are considered as the original settlers of the Philippines. So from the POV of someone not born and raised in the Philippines, it can get very confusing, right? Because you have the Tagalogs, you have the Ilonggos, you have the Kapampangan. So it's easy to brand them already as tribal. But in fact, there are people who are known as IPs, the indigenous people. These are the tribes that persist until today. Some of them consider themselves as unconquered. So they still use the custom and traditions from pre-colonial times up to today. So for me, from the POV of a Filipino, that's the true tribal. These guys are the OG. They're the real tribes. So they were not converted into Catholicism. Examples of IPs include the Bangsamoro, the Lumad, the Cordillera tribes, even the Panay Bukidnon tribe. And then one thing that stands out with these tribes is that they have spear usage. So most of them retain the material and even martial culture of using spears. They have ambush tactics. Some of them even have their bow and arrow. Some of them even have projectile. So here you begin to see the difference between FMA as we know it and these indigenous tribal fighting arts, which leads back to my original distinction of duel versus war. The and how to set apart FMA from what is not FMA. Yeah, so I just like to emphasize that because I think we also have no documentation as of present time of the tribes, the IPs using Espada y Daga. There's no mention of that. That's really an FMA thing because well, it came from the Spanish after all, the Espada y Daga thing. So yeah, I'd like to end my bit there, Elric. I'm open to questions or rejoinders or whatnot. Thank you.
So I would like to add in to the category of dueling, also sport and self defense. The to me the big
Yes.
distinction is apart from the tactics like Raimundo mentioned, things like when it's a sport or even like any kind of competition, whether it's like some kind of cultural thing as opposed to, a separate sport where you're trying to win like a tournament or whatever, or self-defense or a duel or anything like that. The assumption is that you are fighting alone. Whereas with a battlefield art or a war art, you're fighting alongside others, and that's part of the training for soldiers, or training to be part of an army, is to fight with other people. That's the most important part, because you can take a group of
Yes.
people that can all fight well individually and you throw them all out there, and then you get a small group of people who can't fight well individually but they can fight really well together, and the small group that can fight well together will just destroy the rest. And that's how armies work. That's why everything's not decided by heroes that run out there and just decimate armies. It has to do with training to fight alongside with someone, as opposed to training to fight on your own.
Agreed.
Going back to the topic of Espada Daga, I know we got some more slides. I'm leaving it to because these are the rest of what remains are Tim and Raymundo slides. Who'd want to go next, and then we can go to those slides and you can talk about them.
It might be good for Raymundo to talk about what Daga is. Yeah.
Okay. So, slide 14. Yeah.
You want me
You
lower?
can't say 14. You go forward or back.
Oh, sorry. Back a bit. Back one slide. Uh, yeah, paired weapons. Yes. So this one first, and then Daga.
You want me to lower us?
Yeah, why don't you get
please.
Raymundo's going to talk for a little bit, so
Sure.
you can get rid of us.
Yeah, so in historical accounts and in oral tradition, when we say like Espada y Daga, they were not necessarily in the Philippine context. This is the Philippine context. They were not necessarily made by the same maker or originally designed to be paired at all. Because when I went through vintage weapon samples, so this is my POV, those that look alike, like they have the same hilt, same guard design, sometimes even the same blade, with the daga being just a smaller version of the sword. They were already purpose made for tourist consumption and war souvenirs. So the only historical bit that I could find, sorry, about paired weapons actually came from the Balangija massacre of 1901. This happened in summer. So the insurgents tied bolos to each of their wrists, and Koti, may he rest in peace, mentioned that the main purpose of that was that if one hand got injured or the bolo got knocked aside, you still have another. So they didn't do it berserker style, like, or Sinawali style. It wasn't like that. They just needed to have another weapon, a backup weapon, which they could use to hack with. So while the historical mention of sword and spear wield as a paired weapon is very much abundant, that's abundant as opposed to two swords. I haven't found any historical documentation on someone wielding two swords, only the two bolo part. So yeah, that's as far as I know regarding paired weapons. And then Style Ala in his own research also mentioned that the daga component actually can be something as simple as a kitchen knife. Yeah, so doesn't have to be purpose made. I mean, I think even Tim has mentioned before, just correct me if I'm wrong, that the Espada Idaga, they weren't like designed to be made uniformly made, that okay, this set would be an Espada Idaga set, or this would be the only design for Espada Idaga. I don't think it worked that way. So in the next slide, you can see here, next slide, please. Yeah, you can see here an example of a vintage weapon. So this was made for tourist consumption. We call this the Negrito Bolos. So yeah, as you can see, there's a longer blade, there's a shorter blade, and these were very popular with Americans who stayed in the Philippines to train. So I think these came from either the Pampanga or Pangasinan areas, these two weapons. And then next slide, please. Thank you.
We're not there. The slides are not. I'm sorry, Raymundo. The slides are not
Sorry, D.
showing.
Sure, sure,
Oh, you know what?
sure, sure.
Elrik is disappeared.
Oh, okay, okay,
I'm not sure if he's got an internet thing or something. You know what though? He is back.
okay.
There we go.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you, thank you. So yeah, these are the vintage blades I was talking about. I mean, they're Negrito bolos. They're not necessarily made by Negritos, but since the Negrito were popular to the Americans training in the Philippines around 1970s, they were labeled that way so that they would become popular tourist items. So this is one of the many tourist consumption Espada Daga pairs that could be that could be found in museums or floating around eBay. So for me, these are relatively recent already. And then next slide, please. So as I mentioned earlier, the Spanish also use espada y daga as a nobility indicator. In the same way, the Filipinos, when they held their own revolution in the late 1800s, they treated the daga as an officer's weapon. So here on the screen, you can see First Republic era dagger from the Tino Brigade. So General Tino was a Filipino who was known to be very proficient in battlefield tactics and even respected by the Americans. So here you can see an officer's dagger. So when you have a dagger like this, some of them call this Katipunan dagger or First Republic era dagger. This is only worn by officers. So I don't have a picture right now, but pictures of Filipino officers would often have a dagger at their side. Like the usual configuration in pictures was that they would have a long sword. It's usually espada ancha or something, and then they would have this dagger at their side. And some pictures would have only such a dagger at their side. So does this mean that this dagger was used? Not necessarily, because in my experience, these daggers would only have the points sharpened. The side the side edges, the double edges, the majority of these edges were actually unsharpened. Whether they're wavy bladed or whether they're straight, only the point is sharpened. And then why is it that way? Because these daggers are status indicators, so they're actually not designed for battlefield usage. Yeah, but of course, in a pinch, if you're in a pinch, you can actually trust this up to someone since the point is sharpened. But for the most part, when you see a dagger like this is primarily a nobility indicator and not really a battle weapon. Yeah. And then next slide, please. Sorry, am I still on? Yeah.
He's not here. I'm not sure what's going
Okay,
on with
it's okay. Connectivity issues. Yeah.
I don't know. Let me try messing him. I don't know if he's got an internet thing going on. But he's definitely out. What do you want?
And
Do
there, I think he's back. Okay, he's back.
you want to bring up Tim back up?
I think Elrik's back.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, this is actually my last slide. So as I mentioned earlier, these vintage to antique knives, kitchen knives actually, could have been used as daga. They were more likely to be have to become to have been used as daga in the Philippine context because number one, they were readily available. You could just grab them off any kitchen. And number two, they were more easily accessed, much more cheaper to the general populace. as opposed to the nobility dagger that I showed earlier. So if it's to fight with Espada y Daga, this would be most likely what the Filipinos actually use, and not the fancy looking First Republic Katipunan era daggers. A kitchen knife would have sufficed. And with these types, you're actually really sure that they're sharpened, right? So yeah, that concludes my presentation on what would have qualified as a daga in the Philippine context. Yeah, thank you.
Okay, hopefully he's still here. Or yeah, because he was able to change the slide, so maybe he's just okay. Oh, gone. All right, we'll see if he comes back in. And he's here. Okay, good enough.
Oh, that's so weird that it kicked me off. I've been trying
Yeah, I know. I was wondering
and you
what the
couldn't hear
heck.
me. Sorry about that, guys.
No, I don't know what was going on. Yeah.
And I just want to share that, like, I know that a lot of the stuff that Raymundo presented right there, some of that was the field research of Style Allah, and that was stuff that he had done
Yes.
visiting folks in Cebu, Negros, Panay, Samar, Leyte, Mindanao. So it's like he actually did this field research himself, and I know he also went to other areas of the Philippines. So it's just like, so it's important to see when you're doing, like, one thing, because I also get a lot of insight from talking from him, and the idea is like, yeah, there's a material record, but you also do want to listen to the old stories, and you need to talk to people like
Yes.
Stala. I have some of the old folks that I talk to, but there's people like Mark Wiley and Krishna Gohindia, and then like here in the Philippines, people like Romy Macapagal or Tini Makachor, who've actually done a lot of field research in different areas.
Yes.
And then there's people like, say, James Uy, who's actually, he's an expert talking to people specifically in Negros. So there's people like that who are experts for particular areas. Or, like for the Laguna area, got Bundio. He's the expert for that. And he actually is one of those who knows a lot more about certain things in Luzon. So it's good to know the people who you can actually ask who've done the field research and have talked to people. Any more slides that you want to show, Tim? Or
I mean, yeah, but we're coming up on 2 hours, so I don't. I assumed that Dean was going to call it soon.
Well, here's I mean, I think there's plenty more to
Sorry,
talk about.
it's
Well,
James
yeah.
C, not James Oy. I always mess up his name. Sorry, James.
That's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely how would next Wednesday would that work?
That works for me.
I'm gonna be busy, but you guys can do it without me.
Yeah, but I mean, what
It
day
works for
would work
me.
for you?
Works for me.
I got a lot of stuff coming up. I'm gonna be pretty filled for a couple weeks and stuff, Dean. I'm sorry, but
Okay,
I mean,
okay.
there's insights that I think, I know that we've barely scratched the surface of insight and then commentary from Raymundo and Tim. Was there any stuff that you wanted me to cover right now that you could pick apart when I'm not here, Tim?
Well, I mean, if you could bring those slides up, I guess I could kind of,
Okay.
I don't know, give a tease, I guess, and
Yeah,
because
let's get a tease and then we'll.
it's going to take a little while to get into it. I don't want to get too much into it because what I wanted to kind of discuss was the Spanish method of using the sword and dagger, because it's something that's not very commonly known amongst Filipino martial artists, and there's especially if we're going to talk about, because all three of us kind of agree that the sword and dagger method came from the Spanish, but what that means is can have a lot of connotations when that is. So it's important to understand how the Spanish used the sword and dagger. So it'll take a little while. I don't want to give a discourse on now everything about Spanish fencing, but just there's some important pieces to it. So this first little bit, and again, we can look at it in more detail next time. But this is kind of different hilts of Spanish swords, which is important, and how they developed, over the centuries, like um, from the 14th or 15th century all the way up until the mid 17th or so is there was a lot of great change. But the important part is that there's a lot of hand protection there. So if you go to the next slide, um, the on the left there's the daggers. They they typically are a lot simpler with regard to the hand protection. There's two common ones right there. The bottom one you see is, they call it a sail guard. It has hand protection on it that looks like the sails of a ship, like a triangular sail that protects your hand. But it could be just as simple as just a cross. But importantly, is the length of the blade. So the other one kind of shows that's a clip from a 18th century fencing book, or 18th century, that shows some different lengths, and as opposed to the length of the arm. So what's really important, and this is for a lot of reasons, is that the length of the blade, when you're talking about, like Raymundo was talking about with those bolo charges, you don't want a really long blade because it kind of gets in the way and you're going to be hitting other people. When you're dueling, a really long blade is nice, and specifically you want it to be longer than the length, significantly longer than the length of an arm, and that coupled along with the hand protection on these swords is very important. And also the dagger dictates how these weapons are used and how they're used together. So if you go to the next slide, this is an example from this is a late 17th century manual or treatise, and you can see this is an exemplary way of how the weapon is used. And again, we can talk about it in more detail later. But the important part is that you can be far enough away that you can engage with the opponent's blade and still reach to their body or to their head with the blade, which if it's shorter than shorter than arm's length, significantly shorter than arm's length, this won't work. Someone extends their arm and they can prevent your weapon from reaching. And then even in the next slide, when it comes to saber, a lot of people think of saber as very, very much, I'm going to cut at you and then parry. You're going to parry this and cut back, and then I parry that and cut here, which it does have that. But another important part is this same idea that you can. And actually, I really like this. So, Dean, if you could drop us off for a second and just show this so people can see detail. This is one of my favorite pictures. This is from Frias, who wrote a book in the early 19th century about saber fencing. And so this really illustrates the importance of not only the length of the blade but the hand protection, because you can kind of look at this and see that the person on the fencer on the left is getting the better of this exchange. And if you imagine that, let's say there's no hand protection, that hand protection is not there, or it's minimal, then what ends up happening is that both are being injured, right? There's the one on the right being thrusted, the one on the left is getting his hand cut. And so if you then also shorten the lengths of the blades, then suddenly this same technique, this same position, the fencer on the right is actually getting the better of the fencer on the left. He is out of range, is avoiding the cut or thrust, whatever it is, and is able to countercut the opponent's arm. So just by removing that hand protection and shortening the length of the blade, it creates a very different environment in which to use the sword. And so that dictates how these things were used efficiently. And so if you go to the next slide, which I think is the last one, and this is another treatise that is showing an common way of using the sword and dagger. So because with the Spanish, it's very common that the dagger is going to be held in reserve and the sword is primary, and the use of the dagger is for um, detaining or trapping or fouling up the opponent's blade, because there's a really long blade. It can extend very far, and it's very weak and it gets very close. Whereas if you have a shorter weapon, it's easier for the dagger to come into play offensively as opposed to defensively. And so that kind of just that's really the end of it that I wanted to kind of run through real quick, just to give people a taste, and then we can talk about it more in detail and talk about the way that it's used in the Spanish systems and the way that it's used in the Filipino systems, and how they are similar or different.
I can't wait. That's gonna be fascinating because I'm writing questions down that we didn't get to for next time. But
And one thing I just want to add is in this image, that the guy on the left, so R, that exact same posture is found inside of Mirafuente's book.
Yeah, I chose that one specifically for you, Elrik, because I saw that you picked one of the other ones that had that same posture.
I'll go back and jump in real quick. So this is another find from Macallis from 1678, and that document actually referred to this as dos arneses. Does that still make sense in modern Spanish, Tim?
It does. It's just weird. Like, okay. People don't really use that term. Even back then, it was kind of weird to use that term.
Okay, and then so you can see it there. This is not the best image because like the footwork's different because he's using a reverse lead. But there's other images in Mga Karunungan sa Larong Arnis from Yambao Mirafuente, but you can see that this posture in those books. And it's interesting. It's like, yeah, it's a lunge, but it's very similar. It's a almost straight knee lunge that's used in them. But I'd have to pull up that image and pull it up for, I can help you guys prepare that for next time. And hopefully I'm free. I just don't know if I'll be free, Dean. When you guys do next.
You'll know fairly soon, Elrik?
Yeah, I think we should talk offline because it also like, I figure that people respond. We actually didn't even touch on all the questions that we asked people for earlier. So, but it's already been 2 hours and 10 minutes.
Yeah, I'm just going to tell people I'm trying to get them down, but there's so many comments here. So I'm going to tell, when I wrap it up, I'll just make a generic statement to the folks that are watching now as far as the questions for next time. But this has been great. I appreciate it.
I do want to say something to kind of close this out.
Sure.
And I'll let the cat out of the bag. Like some people know, yes, I'm in the United States right now. And one of the people who visited me was Matthew Lawrence, and he had just come from a HEMA tournament. So it's like I got to play with him with rapier, and he was kind enough to share with me like some Distressa that he picked from Tom Ploy, and then I forget some of the Sacramento Distressa folks. And then we also did some saber, and it was very interesting because like I have foil that was like my first martial art, and then also I have my training in blade engagement from Romy Macapagal for steel on steel engagement, and it was like really like there's nothing I could do with Matthew because like he's been training those weapons and his skill was so much higher, and it's really a different thing. Like one of the old myths in FMA is anything you can do with a knife, you can do with your fist, you can do with, a bolo, versus, a long sword. And it's like, yeah, you could, but when you really get to the people who are great at those weapons, it's personalized and it's so refined for that particular weapon. And then it was really great because then I was worried about like, oh my gosh, I'm back in America. Do I suck all of a sudden? But then when we went to playing with steel blunts that like the kind that I'd use with Monromi, then okay, yeah, now I can show him stuff and he couldn't do stuff with me. Because like, we develop skills that are specific for those weapons. We develop pockets and range. So like, yeah, Spanish influence for Espada Daga, absolutely, from my perspective and our perspectives in the historical record. But Filipinos in different areas really developed their own Espada Daga systems. And there's like Luzon stuff that's very particular, but then like, there's more modern stuff that's specific to other areas. And we haven't even talked about like, Baston Idaga, which is actually a real thing because it's like,
Well, actually, that's a question I have from Alvin. So we're gonna cover that.
So that was me closing it up. Unless Tim, Dean, or Mundo want to say anything else.
Thank you for having us.
Oh my gosh,
so
this has
much.
been thank you. This has been so educational. I'm humble and honored to have you guys. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to wait to hear from Elrik. But worst case scenario, we can just go with next Wednesday at 9:00 if that time works for you guys. Hopefully Elrik will be able to join us. So I'll wait to hear from him. But so I'll basically make a part 2 flyer, and we won't need to do a test run. And I'll be hopefully Elrik can get free, and I can't wait. This is good. We're gonna really get into the nitty gritty next time, so I'm excited. But
Always
all right,
a pleasure
guys.
hanging out with you guys. Thank you.
Oh my gosh,
Thank
same.
you.
All right, guys, and so we'll in the group message. I'll wait after I hear from Elrik. We'll be in touch.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks,
All
everyone.
right, guys. Have a good night.
All right, you too. Thank you.
Got you here. All right, folks. That wraps up. I had a feeling it was going to be 2 episodes. So, but anyway, great stuff. So next Wednesday at 9:00. Hopefully, Elrik will be able to join us. If you do have questions and we didn't get to them, if you wouldn't mind, it would really help me out. Just send them if you can send them to me. I got a couple that I was able to write down, but I know I missed some. And right now, to be honest with you guys, I don't have time to go back up to scroll up. So if you could send them to me, it would be such a great help. I would really appreciate it. But anyway, I will see you guys hopefully next Wednesday. All right.